research, there is a group on Facebook called SHIP, and it was actually started by the folks over at Facebook, and it's an online community for UX researchers. You can oftentimes have questions answered there, and there's a lot of kind of conversations happening about UX research and methodology, but it's also a really great way to kind of network and get exposure to different people at different companies. Also, I think just utilizing the network on LinkedIn, think about the companies that you're interested in and the people that you want to get to know at those companies, and look them up on LinkedIn. Add them, reach out, chat with them, try and grab a cup of coffee. And then, of course, another group of people that would be great to add on LinkedIn are recruiters from those companies. Because oftentimes recruiters are the one that are reaching out to people directly to try and loop them into the interviewing process. That's how I got hired at Booking.com, is through a recruiter. And so if you can go on to LinkedIn and find those recruiters and add them to your network, it's going to be a really powerful resource for you to utilize at some point, and also on their end to utilize you as a potential candidate for a new role that they're trying to look to fill. Yeah, it totally depends on the company that you're interviewing with and what their process is. I've done everything from having a single informal interview on campus with maybe a video call to an additional person on the team, to doing the fuller kind of phone interview, followed by phone interview, followed by on-site interview. So it totally varies, but very much so the format tends to be very similar in what we're trying to learn from a candidate in an interview. So one, it's just making sure that you have the core skills and understanding for actually developing and executing research and research studies. And then the other part of it is understanding sort of how you approach methodologies in different projects. So for instance, with research, there's never necessarily any one right method to go after. With each method, there are pros and cons to choosing a methodology. So oftentimes we'll try and figure out through a hypothetical question, what methodology would you choose and why? And how do you kind of weigh those different pros and cons? And then how flexible and open are you to new constraints being added to the problem? So for instance, maybe your budget will change, or maybe they'll ask you to run it in a smaller time frame. They want to see, how do you adapt to that? And do you change your methodology? Because that's a lot of the real world stuff that we deal with. And then lastly, we'll oftentimes try and understand, how do you work with your stakeholders? How do you involve them in the research process? So I think that's kind of what you can expect from a UX research interview. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I love is, although there are no formal kind of school-based programs for UX research, there's tons of resources on the internet from people who are currently UX researchers who are writing about their day-to-day, how they got into the field. So there's tons of things to read. Some of my favorite resources are Medium, actually. A lot of different companies, their research teams write articles for the company on UX research and how they approach different things. There's some really good articles about how to prepare for a UX research interview. And these are all just kind of informal blog posts and articles that people have written. Additionally, especially if you're a qualitative researcher who's trying to kind of prepare for those more quantitative, stat-based questions you might get in an interview, I always use Jeff Sorrow and his blog Measuring You as a resource for kind of updating myself on selecting sample sizes, different analyses and approaches. So there's tons of things on the internet. It's just about Googling them. I think there's also ux.cc. So the internet is your oyster. Yeah, so my first position as a UX researcher was at a startup, and I got my role through networking. And I actually think that's a really great way to get into a startup, because it's a smaller, more tight-knit company. And oftentimes people that work at startups that I know get their role or change to a new startup through the relationships that they have that by going with people that they've already worked with at previous companies or by networking at an event. So for instance, I got my role by going to a wearable tech event and speaking with the head of the R&D team, and they introduced me to the rest of the team, and that's kind of what got me into my position. So I think networking is very important, but I think you also have to approach the interview process a little bit differently, in that you more so have to sort of sell the value that you will bring to the smaller company as a user experience researcher. And it differs a little bit between that and applying to a bigger company where there's less selling of the value you can bring to the smaller team and more so kind of what you want to get out of being a user experience researcher and what skills you want to gain at a bigger company. Yeah, so what I always suggest to people who are interested in getting started at a big company like Google or Facebook is to actually go through contracting. So all of the big companies offer more junior-based contract roles where you're employed through a contracting company, but you're working on a day-to-day basis with teams at Google or Facebook or whatever company it might be. You're embedded with those teams, and you're really getting the experience that anyone else would if they were working with that big company. So you get to learn the skills, you get to network and meet new people within that company. And then most of the time, it typically leads to the ability to actually interview for a full-time role within that company. So it's a really great way to get your foot in the door. It's much easier than going the traditional route of either cold applying or getting started with a recruiter because you already have that experience and that exposure with the team and a lot of the skills that they're looking for specifically when they're looking to hire someone and bring them into that company. Just say, feel empowered to teach yourself as much as you can and to take on any opportunity that you can. It sounds kind of cheesy, but it's what I found to be what worked best for me, as well as to other researchers that I've seen come in at a junior role and sort of rise up in the ranks. I think really utilizing the internet and the resources that I mentioned earlier, it's all out there. And that's really what I did myself. I kind of knew or had a bit of a research background already, but specifically to UX, I really had to become self-taught. And so I really went on the internet and learned all about methodology, learned all about how to approach things in the right way. And it was all through just online resources. And so I'd say feel empowered to do that. Don't feel like you have to go out and get another degree or go get a master's or whatever it might be, because you can really teach yourself both on the internet and then really once you're in the role. So as long as you can say yes to things, even if you haven't tried them before, just say yes and doors will open. People are really receptive to that. So be flexible, feel empowered to teach yourself and to feel confident in your skills when you're self-taught. And then just kind of be strategic in who and how you want to learn from. So for me, going from a startup to then to Google, that was a very strategic move for me. It meant that I could go and work with this pool of really experienced UX researchers who maybe had more formal backgrounds than myself. So I really use that as an opportunity to learn. So I think it's just about figuring out what path you want to take and then taking the steps on your own to teach yourself, to get experience through others. And that's kind of really what you have to do as a UX researcher, since again, we don't really have a formal path to becoming, one of us. Yeah, so there are a lot of challenges. It is still considered a fairly new domain within the tech world, even though it's been around for quite some time. Oftentimes, the biggest issue you'll face as a user experience researcher is having to get buy-in from stakeholders on the value that you and your research brings to the team. That's often because if you're doing something like qualitative research where you're working with a smaller sample size, sometimes a sample as low as 8 to 10, you'll have people who won't believe in the data because they think you can't get valid findings from a sample so low. So you really have to work with your stakeholders to teach them about why do we work with a small sample size? What value does that bring? How can we generalize data based off of a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. And that's often the biggest thing you'll face, is just kind of getting buy-in and helping them to understand how what you're doing is just as valid as running an experiment with a really, really large sample size. Yeah, so for an entry level research position, you should at least have some kind of base understanding of research, how to plan a study, what's involved in developing a research plan, how to select users for recruitment, and an understanding of the different methodologies and how to implement them. It's also helpful to have a basic understanding of the tech world, who the different stakeholders are, who does product develop, what does product development look like, um, and I think really though the ultimate skill or trait for an entry level UX researcher is that you should have the ability to be open and flexible. So oftentimes when you come in as an entry level researcher, you'll be asked to take on projects for things you may not have done before or to try a new methodology that you haven't. And so I think being open and willing to figure it out and just go and get it done to help your team is the best trait that you could really have and a really good skill. And that's really what I look for in more junior researchers when I'm interviewing.